The wind howled like a wounded beast, its icy claws tearing at Eleanor Thompson's worn shawl. She pulled it tighter around her shoulders, but the cold seeped through her skin, gnawing at her bones. The snow, thick and relentless, blanketed the earth, erasing every trace of life. There was nothing left. No house, no family, just the endless white void of the unforgiving wilderness. Her breath came in sharp, frozen gasps, her hands trembling as she pushed forward, one step after another, praying for warmth, for shelter. The world around her felt as hollow as the ache in her chest. 3 days without food, 3 days without rest. But still she walked. Still, she fought the storm. If she stopped now, the cold would take her. And she knew it. She had nowhere else to go. She had nothing left. The only option was forward. And then, just when the thought of collapsing into the snow became unbearable, she saw it. The cabin, barely visible through the swirling snow, its silhouette loomed in the distance. It was her last hope, and she moved toward it with every ounce of strength she had left. When she reached the door, she didn't knock. She couldn't. Her hands were too numb, too weak. She just pushed it open, desperate. Inside, the warmth hit her like a punch to the gut, but the figure inside froze her in place. Nathaniel Hawke. He stood by the fire, his tall, imposing frame a stark contrast to her frailty. His eyes, cold and unblinking, studied her with a mixture of curiosity and something darker. "What do you want?" His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against stone. She couldn't answer, couldn't find the words. She was so tired, so hungry, but she wasn't about to beg. Not yet, not unless she had to. Nathaniel took a step forward, his boots crunching softly on the wooden floor. His presence was overwhelming, his power undeniable. She could feel the heat from the fire, but his gaze was the thing that made her shiver. "You need shelter," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "And I need a hand around here." The tension between them was thick, a pulsing, dangerous thing. She felt it in her chest, in the pit of her stomach. But there was something else, too. Something buried beneath the coldness. A promise. A protection. She couldn't explain it, but she knew, deep down, that this man, as dangerous as he seemed, was the only person who could keep her alive. But could she trust him? Could she make it through this storm with him? The door creaked shut behind Eleanor with a low groan, cutting off the howling wind that had followed her inside. The warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth, but the chill of the storm still clung to her skin. Her breath came out in quick, visible bursts, mingling with the smoke rising from the flames. Nathaniel stood across from her, still and silent, his eyes never leaving her as he leaned against the rough-hewn wood of the cabin wall. The air between them thickened with unspoken tension, the only sound the soft pop and crack of the fire. She could feel his gaze like a tangible thing, sharp, like the edge of a blade. The space between them seemed impossibly vast, yet impossibly small. His presence filled the room, pressing against her, making the cabin feel even colder despite the warmth of the fire. Eleanor stood her ground, but her fingers, still numb from the cold, betrayed her. They trembled ever so slightly as she tried to loosen the shawl around her neck. Nathaniel noticed, his dark eyes flicking to her hands before returning to her face, studying her every move with a quiet intensity that made her stomach flutter. "You're safe here." His voice was low, almost a growl, as if he were stating a simple fact. But it carried weight, a promise, and something else. Something deeper. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she had no choice. The cold had already begun to creep back in, seeping into her bones. She had nowhere else to go. "I'm not here for charity," she said, her voice unsteady but firm. "I'll work. I can help." Her words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and unsure. He watched her for a long moment, then pushed himself off the wall and walked toward her. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one heavy with purpose. When he reached her, he stopped just short of touching her, his gaze locking with hers, dark and unreadable. "You'll do more than work," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper that seemed to reverberate in the space between them. "You'll stay? You'll be safe. As long as you understand that I'm the one who decides what happens here." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The weight of his words settled heavily over her. The power he held was palpable, and for a moment, she wanted to pull away. But she didn't. She couldn't. The storm raged outside, but inside, the heat between them was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. She felt it pull at her, a magnetic force she couldn't escape. She stepped back, but only a step, feeling the heat of the fire on her back. She wanted to say something, but her words failed her. Nathaniel's eyes flickered with something that could have been amusement, but she wasn't sure. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of the unspoken. She had no idea how long they stood there, just inches apart, but the tension was unbearable. Her pulse raced, her skin tingled, and yet, she couldn't move. She was caught between wanting to run and needing to stay. Finally, Nathaniel broke the silence. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice still that low, steady growl. "Tomorrow, you'll learn what it means to live here. But tonight," he glanced toward the fire, then back to her. "Tonight, you'll rest. Tomorrow, we start." The promise of what tomorrow might bring hung in the air between them, heavy and uncertain. Eleanor didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't leaving this cabin. Not tonight, and not anytime soon. The fire crackled low, casting shadows that danced across the cabin's walls. The storm outside had only grown worse, the wind howling like a beast in pain. Eleanor stood by the hearth, her back to Nathaniel, still struggling to find her place in this strange, dangerous world. Her hands, still cold and shaking, rested against the wooden beam above the fire. She hadn't spoken since the night before, and neither had he. The silence between them felt thick, like the very air had frozen. Nathaniel's presence in the room was almost too much. His eyes, always watchful, always calculating, never left her. She could feel them on her skin, even from the other side of the room. Every step she took, every breath she exhaled, was measured by him. She had to fight the urge to pull away, to break the tension, but she couldn't. Not yet. Not when she had nothing to offer but herself. "You'll stay here." Nathaniel's voice broke the silence, low and rough like the wind itself. She froze. His words weren't a suggestion. They weren't a plea. They were a command. She felt it, that undercurrent of authority, of control that seeped into everything he said. She felt it deep in her chest, like the weight of the storm outside was nothing compared to the weight of his gaze. "And you'll work," he continued, his figure casting a long shadow in the flickering firelight. "I need you, Eleanor, whether you like it or not." She turned then, her eyes flashing. The defiance in her stirred, though her body still trembled from the cold. "I didn't ask for charity," she snapped. "I came here because I have no choice." His lips twisted slightly, as though he were amused by her fire. "I know that," he said, his eyes softening just enough to make her doubt what she had just said. He took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. Eleanor didn't move. Her heart raced, but she held her ground. The air was thick with tension, every movement between them slow, deliberate, like two animals circling each other in a standoff. She could feel the heat of his body now, the raw power in the way he moved, and for a moment, it almost made her want to step closer, let the warmth of his presence flood over her. But she didn't. She couldn't. If she did, there would be no going back. The fire crackled again, louder this time, breaking the moment. She took a deep breath, the cold air still biting her skin. "You're not going to just let me leave, are you?" she asked, her voice softer now, tinged with something more uncertain than defiant. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, watching her, his face unreadable. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then, finally, he spoke. "You think I'll let you walk out into that storm again? You're safer here. For now, at least." The way he said it made her shiver, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something darker, something she couldn't quite name. He took another step closer, and this time, she didn't move back. He stood just a breath away from her, the space between them filled with the tension of everything unspoken. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against hers. The touch was gentle, almost too gentle for a man like him, but it carried weight. It spoke of control, of protection, and of something she couldn't escape. She could feel her breath catch in her throat. The distance between them was gone, and in that moment, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't sure if she wanted to run anymore. Nathaniel's eyes flickered to her lips, then back to her eyes. "You're not leaving," he said, and for the first time, Eleanor heard a promise in his voice. A promise that felt more like a warning. A promise that changed everything. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, rattling the old wooden beams as Eleanor sat by the fire, staring into the dancing flames. The night was colder than before, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and something heavier. Nathaniel moved silently in the shadows, his silhouette barely visible against the flickering light. She could feel him watching her, his presence filling the room like the storm outside. He hadn't said much since the night before, but there was no mistaking the tension that clung to the air. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, feel the quiet control he exuded, and it stirred something inside her, something fierce and uncomfortable. She wasn't sure how much longer she could sit in silence. "You're not going to keep me here forever," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. Nathaniel didn't move. "What makes you think I want to keep you?" His voice was low, but the coldness of it wrapped around her like a tightrope. She swallowed, her fingers tightening against the edge of the chair. "I won't just sit here and be at your mercy." She could feel the shift in the room. The power dynamic between them, so clearly defined before, was beginning to crack. Nathaniel took a step forward, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. His eyes never left hers, and though his expression remained unreadable, there was something new, something more intense, in his gaze. "You think you have a choice?" He stepped closer still, until he was only inches away. The space between them had closed, but the silence between them had never been. Louder. Eleanor didn't step back, though every instinct in her screamed too. His presence was like an anchor, pulling her in, and the dangerous tension crackled in the air like static before a storm. "I'm not your prisoner," she said, her voice quieter now, but her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let him make her feel small. She couldn't. Nathaniel's gaze softened for the briefest moment before he moved even closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, the strength in every movement. His breath was warm against her skin. He reached out then, not to touch her, but to gently lift her chin with his finger. The gesture was simple, yet it sent a shiver down her spine. "You're not a prisoner, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice low and controlled. "But you're here because I allow it." The weight of his words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. "And if I refuse?" she asked, the challenge clear in her tone. Nathaniel's lips barely curled into a smile, but it was enough to send a wave of unease through her. "Then you'll be out there," he said, gesturing toward the storm, his voice suddenly colder than the winter wind. "And if you think that's an option, you'll be dead by morning." The threat was silent, but no less real. She could hear the truth in his words, could feel the weight of it settle in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was more afraid of what he could do, or of what she might have to do in order to survive. The fire crackled, the only sound between them as the tension built and coiled tighter. His hand was still on her chin, and she felt it like a brand against her skin. It was possessive, but gentle, as though he was reminding her of the hold he had over her. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. And in that moment, she realized just how much control he had over her life. She was trapped in this storm, in this cabin, with him. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if she wanted to leave. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow that danced on the walls of the cabin, its light flickering over Eleanor's face. She sat on the edge of the chair, her body tense, every nerve on high alert. Outside, the storm still raged, the wind howling through the cracks in the wooden walls, but inside, there was a heavy silence between them. Nathaniel stood by the fire, his broad shoulders cast in shadow, the flames reflecting off his rugged features. He hadn't moved in minutes, his gaze fixed on her, like he was waiting for something, or perhaps waiting for her to break. Eleanor couldn't stand the silence. It was suffocating, pressing in on her. She had to speak, had to do something to fill the heavy air. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He just continued to watch her, his eyes dark and unreadable. The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife, but there was something else now, something new, something deeper. Eleanor felt it in the pit of her stomach. She had been running from it, from the way his presence made her feel. But now, she couldn't deny it any longer. She was starting to depend on him. She hated that, hated how his very existence seemed to pull her in, like a magnetic force. She was a woman who had always stood on her own 2 feet, And yet here she was, sitting in front of him, vulnerable, exposed, her heart pounding in her chest. "Because you need me." Nathaniel's voice was low, almost a growl, as he took a step closer to her. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't look away from him, couldn't escape the pull of his presence. She wanted to. She should have. But she didn't. "I don't need you," she replied, though the words felt like a lie even as they left her mouth. She didn't need him. Not really. But the thought of being alone in this storm again, of stepping back into the freezing night, made her feel like she might break. "You're wrong," Nathaniel said, his voice steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something almost gentle. "You think you're strong, but you're not. Not out there. Not in this world. Not anymore." He was right, and that terrified her. She had always been strong, always had to be. But now, in the presence of this man, she was starting to feel the cracks in her armor. The fire crackled again, louder this time, the heat of it seeping into her skin, but the warmth didn't reach her heart. Nathaniel took another step closer, and this time, she didn't pull away. His presence was overwhelming, and yet, it was also something she needed. Something she couldn't push away any longer. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling just a little, though she fought to keep it steady. Nathaniel's eyes softened, just for a moment. "I want you to trust me," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and pregnant with meaning. Eleanor didn't know how to respond. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that he could protect her, that he could be the strength she needed. But a part of her still fought against it. Still fought against the way he made her feel. Still fought against how much she needed him, and how much he wanted to control everything around her. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words never came. Instead, she found herself standing, drawn toward him like she had no control over her own body. The space between them had closed to nothing now, and the air was thick with something unspoken. Nathaniel reached out, his hand brushing lightly against hers. The touch was so small, so subtle, but it sent a jolt through her. She hadn't realized how badly she wanted to feel his touch until that moment. Her heart raced, her breath shallow, and she could feel the heat from the fire against her back, the cold from the storm still nipping at the edges of the cabin. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. Nathaniel's hand remained there, steady, unwavering, and she didn't pull away. In that moment, she understood. She was no longer in control of this, and that terrified her. The storm outside had only grown worse, the wind now a deafening roar that rattled the cabin's walls like a living thing. The night seemed endless, and Eleanor could feel the cold creeping into her very bones, even with the fire blazing. She had never felt so isolated, so small against the unforgiving world outside. Inside, the tension between her and Nathaniel hung thick in the air, a silence more oppressive than the storm itself. She hadn't realized just how much she'd come to depend on him, how much his presence had become a lifeline in the chaos of her life. But the fear lingered. The fear of being trapped, of being at the mercy of someone who could take everything from her. His quiet strength both comforted and terrified her. Nathaniel was close now, too close. Every move he made, every breath he took, seemed to make the space between them shrink until she could feel his heat against her skin, could smell the earth and wood on him. She wanted to pull away, but something inside her, something raw and primal, held her there. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, a shrill wail that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the cabin. Nathaniel looked at her then, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to see inside her soul. "You're afraid," he said softly, his voice low, almost a whisper. Eleanor didn't answer, didn't know how to. She was afraid, but not just of him. She was afraid of what she might become if she stayed. Afraid of the power he had over her, the way his presence made her feel both safe and vulnerable. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. She was afraid. Afraid of being alone again. Afraid of being left in the cold. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer, his hand brushing lightly against hers. The touch was so small, so subtle, yet it sent a shock through her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she realized, with a jolt, that she was beginning to crave the contact. Crave him. "You're not alone," he said, his voice almost a growl, as if he were reminding her of something she already knew. She looked at him, And in that moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, something soft, something that betrayed his hard exterior. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that familiar intensity. "You need to understand," Nathaniel continued, his voice harder now, more controlled. "I'm not offering you safety. I'm offering you survival." The weight of his words settled on her chest, a suffocating pressure. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she didn't need his protection, but the truth was, she did. She had nothing left. No one. And the storm outside seemed to press in, its fury growing louder, closer. She could feel the isolation tightening around her, a physical weight she couldn't shake. And yet, there was something about Nathaniel, about the way he was willing to stand between her and the world, that made her want to surrender. But surrendering meant admitting she couldn't survive on her own. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. The air in the cabin was thick with tension, and the moment hung in the balance between them, a precarious line neither one of them was willing to cross, yet neither one could resist. And then, from outside, there came a sound, a low, mournful cry that pierced through the howling wind. Eleanor froze, her heart racing. Nathaniel stiffened beside her, his eyes narrowing. "We're not alone," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Eleanor felt the familiar chill of fear creep down her spine as the sound grew louder, closer. Something was coming, and whatever it was headed straight for them. The wind outside screamed like a wild animal, clawing at the cabin, rattling the walls and the roof as if trying to tear everything apart. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced and twisted across the room, but the warmth it offered felt thin, a mere illusion against the cold that bled through the cracks in the wood. Eleanor stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared into the swirling white chaos beyond. Every part of her screamed to run, to escape the pressure of this place, of Nathaniel, but the storm outside was a constant reminder. There was nowhere to go. Nowhere but here. She turned, and Nathaniel was there, standing in the doorway, his frame blocking the faint light from the fire, his eyes fixed on her with a quiet intensity that made her heart race. He had been silent for what felt like hours, watching her, waiting for her to make a choice, but now, it was time. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point, thick and suffocating. "You can't leave." Nathaniel's voice was low, barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the air like a blade. Eleanor swallowed, her throat dry. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she had to leave, that she couldn't stay in this place with him, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was, she was scared. She was scared of the storm outside, yes, but more than that, she was scared of the storm inside her. The storm he had awakened in her heart. The way his presence, his touch, made her feel both alive and trapped. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking, not just from the cold. "I can't stay here. I'm not like you. I don't need anyone to save me." The words felt heavy as they left her mouth, but even as she said them, she knew they were a lie. She didn't need him. She needed him more than she cared to admit. But admitting it would mean acknowledging just how much control he had over her, how much she depended on him. Nathaniel took a step forward, his boots silent against the wooden floor. The air between them crackled with the weight of unsaid things. He didn't speak right away, just closed the distance between them until they were standing so close she could feel the heat of his body against hers. His hand reached out, brushing against her arm, and her breath hitched. She felt it again. The pull, the need, the desire to stay, to surrender to the warmth he offered. But she couldn't. She couldn't let go of the one thing she had left, her independence. "I won't let you die out there," he said, his voice rough, like the sound of the wind outside. It wasn't a plea. It was a command, a promise. But Eleanor wasn't sure if it was a promise to her, or a promise to himself. She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "You can't keep me here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't get to decide what happens to me." Nathaniel's gaze softened for just a moment, a flicker of something deep within him that made her stomach twist. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the cool, calculating expression that had always been there. "I'm not trying to control you," he said, his voice quiet, but there was a steel edge to it. "But I'm not letting you go. Not now. Not in this storm." The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her chest tightening with the weight of his words. There was no escape from him, not from this cabin, not from this feeling. She was trapped. She was dependent. And for the first time, she realized that she wasn't sure if she wanted to leave. She wasn't sure if she wanted to escape from him, or if, deep down, she was starting to need him just as much as he needed her. The storm outside howled louder, a final warning, a cry from the wilderness that they both ignored. And in that moment, Nathaniel reached out again, his hand cupping her face gently, the touch sending a jolt of heat through her. His thumb brushed against her cheek, soft, yet possessive. Her pulse quickened, and her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to pull away, but she couldn't. She didn't want to. "I'll keep you safe," Nathaniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, his face close enough that she could feel his breath mingling with hers. "But you have to trust me." Eleanor closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She wanted to fight it. She wanted to resist. But the truth was, she had no choice. Not anymore. The storm was closing in, and so was the truth. The fire in the hearth had dimmed, its flames now little more than a whisper against the dark. The wind howled outside, its eerie song rattling the cabin, but inside, there was a heavy silence. Eleanor sat by the fire, her eyes distant, staring into the fading embers as if searching for something she couldn't quite grasp. The storm outside was still there, a reminder of the world that continued to rage beyond these walls, but it felt far away now. The real storm, the one that had passed through them both, had left its mark. Nathaniel stood near the window, his back to her, his silhouette framed by the dark, his broad shoulders tense. He hadn't said a word since their last exchange. Neither had she. The quiet between them was thick, charged with the weight of unspoken truths, of things that had shifted between them in ways neither of them had expected. She had let him in. She had let him touch her, let him get close in ways she hadn't planned on. And now, she didn't know what to do with the feeling that had taken root inside her, the vulnerability, the fear, the need. She had been so sure of herself before, so certain that she could survive alone. But now, with him in the room, with the memory of his touch lingering in the air, she wasn't so sure anymore. Nathaniel's voice broke the silence, his tone as low as the wind outside. "You're quiet." She didn't answer at first. What could she say? What was there left to say? The truth was, she didn't know what she felt anymore. She didn't know what to make of the way he looked at her, the way his presence made her feel both safe and unsettled at the same time. "You don't have to say anything," he continued, his voice softer now, but no less certain. "I know." She looked at him then, really looked at him. He was still standing by the window, but his eyes were on her now, intense and searching. "You've been hiding from it," he said, his words almost a whisper. "From me. From yourself." The accusation hung in the air, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She couldn't. He was right. She had been hiding. Hiding from the way she needed him. Hiding from the way he made her feel. "I'm not a child," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I can make my own choices." Nathaniel stepped away from the window then, moving slowly, deliberately, his presence filling the room once more. "And you've made one," he said quietly, his voice heavy with meaning. "But that doesn't mean you're ready for what comes next." The words hung between them, sharp and undeniable. She didn't know what he meant, but she knew enough to understand that the stakes had changed. She had been so sure that she could leave when she was ready, but now, she wasn't so sure. The space between them had narrowed, but the distance between what they wanted and what they feared was still wide. The air in the room seemed to shift, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor allowed herself to feel the weight of it. The weight of what they had shared. The weight of what they still might share. And that terrified her. Because in that moment, she knew. She knew that she couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding behind her walls. Not anymore. Nathaniel didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself, and for the first time in days, allowed herself to truly feel what she had been avoiding. The heat in her chest, the flutter of something more than fear, more than survival. But before she could speak, before she could say the words that had been on the tip of her tongue, a sound broke through the silence. A knock, soft but urgent, on the door. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Nathaniel's eyes snapped to the door, and for the first time since they had met, something flickered across his face. Something dark, something dangerous. Without a word, he moved to the door, his movements quick and sure, But Eleanor stayed where she was, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was it? What did they want? Was the danger outside finally closing in? As Nathaniel reached the door, he paused, his hand resting on the handle. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Stay here," he said, his voice a low command. And just like that, everything she had been avoiding came rushing back to her. The choice, the fear, the need to protect and be protected. And as Nathaniel opened the door, Eleanor knew that nothing would be the same again. Nathaniel's hand hovered over the door handle, his gaze sharp as he listened for any sound from beyond. The room had grown quieter, the storm's fury now muted by the thick walls of the cabin. Eleanor stayed where she was, her breath shallow as she waited. She could feel the change in the air, the way everything had shifted between them. The quiet tension that had been thick with uncertainty now felt different. She wasn't the same woman who had stepped into this cabin, cold and alone. Not anymore. Nathaniel opened the door with a slow, deliberate motion, and Eleanor's pulse quickened. She could see the faint outline of a figure in the darkness, but the rest was swallowed by the shadows. Without a word, Nathaniel stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed was almost oppressive. Eleanor stood, frozen for a moment. She hadn't meant to act, hadn't meant to make a choice, but the moment had come, and she knew. She couldn't stay here, not under these circumstances. Her heart pounded as she moved toward the door, her eyes briefly glancing at the shadows on the walls where Nathaniel's presence had once been. There was a weight in her chest, a pull toward him, but there was also something else, something pulling her in the other direction. She didn't know if she was ready for the next step, but the thought of remaining passive, of allowing him to control everything, was too much. She opened the door quietly, just enough to peek outside. Nathaniel was standing at the edge of the cabin, his back to her, speaking to the figure in the dark. His posture was tense, his words clipped, but Eleanor couldn't hear what they were saying. Her instincts screamed at her to close the door, to retreat back into the warmth of the cabin, but something inside her, something stronger than fear, kept her there, watching. She knew she couldn't keep hiding, couldn't keep running from the truth. She wasn't the helpless woman she had been when she first arrived. No, she had a choice. And for the first time since she had walked into Nathaniel's world, she was about to make it. She stepped outside, the cold biting at her skin, but she barely felt it. Her eyes locked on Nathaniel's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them seemed to stretch and shrink all at once, the space between them charged with everything they hadn't said, everything they hadn't dared to say. The figure in the shadows was gone now, the door swinging shut behind them with a soft creak. But Nathaniel didn't move. He just stood there, watching her with that steady, intense gaze that seemed to see through everything. "You think you have a choice?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl. Eleanor met his gaze head-on, unflinching. "I think I do," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. Nathaniel took a step toward her, his boots heavy on the floorboards, but he stopped just short of touching her. His breath was visible in the cold air, mingling with hers, and for a moment, the space between them was filled with the weight of everything unspoken. She could feel the tension, the pull of something primal between them, but she refused to back down. "You're not the only one who has something to lose," she said quietly. Nathaniel's eyes softened for the briefest moment, a flicker of something hidden beneath the cold exterior he always wore. For a moment, just a moment, he wasn't the man who controlled everything around him. He was just a man, standing in front of her, with his own fears and uncertainties. But the softness was gone in an instant, replaced by the quiet intensity that had always been there. "Then you know what's at stake," he replied, his voice steady but with an edge she couldn't ignore. "And you know what I'll do to protect you." Eleanor didn't know if it was the storm outside or the storm between them, but something in that moment shifted. She had always thought she could survive alone. She had always prided herself on being strong, on not needing anyone. But now, standing in front of Nathaniel, with the storm howling around them and the world outside threatening to swallow her whole, she realized something. She didn't want to be alone anymore. But would that mean surrendering herself to him? And was that what she truly wanted? The air between them thickened, the tension growing tighter, as Nathaniel reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on her arm. She felt it, the weight of the choice she had to make. And as her heart raced in her chest, The door behind them creaked open again. This time, there was no turning back. The wind howled outside, a violent scream that tore through the night, the snow whipping in all directions like 1,000 knives. The cold was unbearable, biting into skin and bone, but the heat between them, between Eleanor and Nathaniel, was undeniable. She stood in the middle of the cabin, facing him, her breath shallow, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside her. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, and she could feel it with every passing second. Nathaniel's eyes were locked on hers, his face hard but unreadable. The distance between them was smaller now, but it felt like an abyss, a space filled with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. "You know what you need to do," Nathaniel said, his voice low, yet it seemed to reverberate through her very soul. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. The storm outside roared louder, the walls of the cabin shaking with its fury. She could feel the pressure of the cold, seeping in, threatening to freeze her in place. But it was the storm inside her that was truly overwhelming. "I can't keep hiding from this," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. She hated how vulnerable she felt, how unsure she was about everything. About him, about herself. "I need to know if you're really offering me a choice." Nathaniel didn't flinch. He took a step toward her, and the air around them seemed to crackle with intensity. His eyes never left hers, and for a moment, she could see the walls he had built around himself start to crack. "You're not the only one who has to make a choice," he said quietly, his voice rough with something she couldn't quite name. She felt the weight of his words, the weight of the unspoken promise between them. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, and Eleanor's heart beat faster with every passing second. She knew what he was asking, and she knew the answer, but the truth was more complicated than that. She could feel the pull toward him, feel the heat of his presence like a force she couldn't resist. But at the same time, she could feel the pull of the storm outside, the pull of the world that had always felt like her only option. The question was no longer just about survival. It was about freedom, and what she was willing to sacrifice for it. Nathaniel was closer now, so close that she could feel the heat radiating off him, and for a moment, she thought she might lose herself in him, in the promise of protection, of something more. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not when everything she had ever known was still out there, waiting for her. "I don't want to be your prisoner," she whispered, the words coming out before she could stop them. Nathaniel's eyes darkened, and for a moment, she thought he might lash out, but instead, he took another step back. He was giving her space, but the tension between them only grew. "You're not my prisoner," he said, his voice low, but there was a hardness to it now, something more controlled. "But the world out there, it's not what it seems. You can't leave, Eleanor. Not now. Not when I've given you everything I have." Her pulse quickened. She knew the weight of his words, knew that what he was offering was more than just safety. It was everything. But at what cost? The storm outside howled louder, and for a moment, the air felt thick with indecision. She was so close to making a choice, so close to understanding what it meant to stay, to accept what Nathaniel was offering. But the fear of losing herself, of losing her freedom, held her back. She didn't know if she could let go of the past, of the life she had fought so hard to survive. But she also knew that there was something between them, something she couldn't ignore, something that made her heart race and her body ache. And just as the tension reached its peak, a distant sound broke through the chaos, the faintest crack of wood, the slightest shift in the air. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Nathaniel's gaze snapped toward the door, his body tensing. They weren't alone anymore. The fire had burned down to a small, glowing ember, casting a dim, flickering light over the cabin. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. The air was cold, the dawn's light creeping slowly over the horizon, painting the room with pale shades of gray. Eleanor sat near the hearth, her body weary, her thoughts tangled like the remnants of the firewood that still smoldered. Nathaniel stood by the window, his back to her, but she could feel his presence, strong, steady, like the quiet after the storm. The distance between them felt different now, not a gap of miles, but of something deeper, something emotional, something they could no longer ignore. The tension that had gripped them so tightly before now seemed to unravel, but it wasn't over. Not yet. She had made her choice, and so had he. You didn't have to come back, she said, her voice soft, but there was no bitterness in it anymore. Nathaniel didn't turn to face her immediately, and for a moment, the stillness in the room was almost too much to bear. Then, slowly he turned. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw something that hadn't been there before, something open, something vulnerable. I didn't, he said quietly, the words a confession, not a denial. He walked toward her, but he didn't crowd her. His steps were slow, measured, as if he was giving her the space to decide what to do next, even though the choice had already been made. The cabin was quiet, save for the sound of their breathing, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath with them. Nathaniel stopped just in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, but still a respectful distance away. I've been alone for too long, he said, his voice rough, but there was an honesty in it now that made her chest tighten. But I don't want to be alone anymore. Eleanor didn't know what to say. The words she had kept buried inside for so long, the fear, the doubt, the longing, all seemed to fade in that moment. She was still scared. She still didn't fully understand what this was between them, but the truth was right in front of her. She had been hiding from it, but not anymore. She wasn't alone, and neither was he. The air between them shifted then, a quiet understanding settling in the space where tension had once been. Nathaniel reached out, not forcefully, but with a gentleness that took her by surprise. His hand brushed against hers, a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that touch, she felt everything they had been through, everything they were, and everything they could be. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she didn't know if she was going to pull away or lean in closer. But when she looked at him, when she really looked, she realized that the fear she had felt wasn't fear of him. It was fear of what she was becoming. Fear of needing someone. But it wasn't just about needing him. It was about trusting him. Trusting herself. She slowly, almost hesitantly, placed her hand in his. It was a simple act, but it was the beginning of something neither of them could deny anymore. He didn't pull her in. He didn't rush her. He simply held her hand, steady and sure, as if telling her that whatever happened next, they would face it together. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that maybe the storm outside wasn't the real danger. The real danger was the part of her that had always been afraid to connect, to trust. But now, she was ready to face that fear. Together. Nathaniel didn't say anything more. The air between them had changed, and the silence that followed was full of meaning. It wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The morning light crept through the cracks in the wooden walls, soft and pale, painting the cabin in hues of gray and gold. The storm had passed, but its lingering chill still clung to the air, seeping into the corners of the room where the fire had long since died down. The silence was thick, almost sacred, as if the world outside had taken a breath and waited for them to follow. Eleanor sat by the window, her fingers brushing the cool glass as she stared out at the empty horizon. The snow had stopped falling, but the landscape was still a blur of white, untouched and endless. She had thought the storm would be the hardest part, but now, it seemed that the hardest part was what came after. The air in the cabin felt different now. The space between her and Nathaniel, though still there, was no longer a barrier. It was simply a reminder of what had happened between them. She could still feel the weight of his touch from the night before, the steadiness in his hand, and the way he had looked at her, like he was waiting for her to make a choice. But that choice, it seemed, had already been made. Nathaniel was sitting across from her now, his eyes watching her with a calm that made her heart race. He hadn't said much since the storm had passed, but there was an understanding in the way he looked at her, an understanding that she didn't need words to explain what had happened. He reached for the last piece of firewood, his movements slow and deliberate. The crackle of the wood as he placed it on the hearth was the only sound in the room. He didn't speak as he worked, but Eleanor knew he was waiting for her to say something, anything. But she didn't know what to say. The truth was, there was nothing left to say. They had both made their choices. They had both been changed. She stood up, the cold floor beneath her feet grounding her, and walked toward him. Her steps were sure, and yet, with every inch closer, the space between them seemed to grow. More intense. Nathaniel looked up at her as she reached him, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet strength that she couldn't escape. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His gaze was enough. She reached out then, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on his shoulder. The touch was small, but in that moment, it meant everything. It was a silent promise. A promise that they had both faced the storm, and now, they would face whatever came next, together. He didn't pull away. Instead, he lowered his hand to hers, his grip steady and reassuring. There was no tension now, no distance. Just the quiet understanding between them, like the stillness of the morning that surrounded them. Eleanor could feel the shift inside her. The fear that had once gripped her was gone, replaced by something softer, something that felt like home. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time, she realized that she didn't have to be. Nathaniel's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, he looked like the man he had always been, not the rugged protector, not the one who had been alone for so long, but just a man who was willing to trust. And that trust, that connection, was all they needed. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence of acceptance, of understanding. The world outside was still cold, still harsh, but inside the cabin, there was warmth now. Not from the fire, but from something deeper, something between them. Eleanor's fingers tightened around Nathaniel's hand, and she didn't let go. She didn't have to. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the vast, open plains. The wind was gentle now, a soft whisper that carried the warmth of the day and the scent of fresh grass. The storm, the cold, the tension, everything that had once felt so immediate, so suffocating, had faded into the distance. What remained was a quiet stillness, a peace that stretched across the land like the endless sky. Eleanor and Nathaniel stood together, side by side, watching the fading light of the day. The cabin was behind them now, a distant memory of their past struggles, but ahead of them lay the open world, waiting for whatever came next. It felt different now. Everything had changed. They had both come to terms with the truth of who they were, who they had become, and what they meant to each other. No longer was there fear in Eleanor's chest, no longer the uncertainty of what the future might hold. There was only the presence of Nathaniel, steady and unyielding beside her, his hand brushing against hers in a silent promise. He had been the one to protect her, but in doing so, he had allowed her to find the strength to protect herself. And now, she realized, she wasn't alone anymore. The distance that had once been between them, a vast chasm filled with hesitation and doubt, had closed. What had started as survival had turned into something deeper, something they could not walk away from. Nathaniel's eyes met hers, steady and sure. There was no need for words now. No more hesitation. The warmth that had once been reserved for the fire now flowed between them, a quiet understanding that needed no explanation. His gaze softened, the hardness of his past slipping away with the light of the setting sun. He reached out then, his fingers brushing against her cheek with the gentleness of someone who had learned, through hard lessons, what it meant to truly protect. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes for a moment as the weight of it washed over her. For so long, she had fought against the idea of needing anyone, of depending on anyone. But now, standing here with Nathaniel, she understood. It wasn't weakness to need someone. It was strength, the kind that came from trust, from knowing that you didn't have to face the world alone. You're not alone, Nathaniel said quietly, his voice a soft promise, a truth that seemed to settle into her bones. Eleanor opened her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw the future ahead of her, not as a battlefield, not as a place to escape, but as a place where she could truly belong. The connection between them was no longer just about survival. It was about living, about choosing each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The past was behind them, its shadows fading with the last of the storm. And in that moment, Eleanor knew, without a doubt, that this was where she was meant to be. No more running, no more hiding, just the vast, open land before them. And the man beside her, who had become more than just her protector. He had become her equal. The sun dipped lower, casting its final rays over the land, and as the light faded, they stood together, no longer two separate souls, but one. And in that silence, in that shared stillness, Eleanor realized that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones fought within. And sometimes, the greatest victory was simply knowing when to let go, to trust, and to finally let yourself be found.